Welcome to Mystery Theater. Thank you to channel friend and supporter Michael Batista. Your amazing contributions are greatly appreciated, Michael. To support the channel, please go to paypal.me/JasonHebert1. And for more incredible true crime stories, please do not forget to click subscribe below. When Karl Karlsen left his Northern California home for the greener pastures of Seneca County, New York in the early 2000s, he was leaving a streak of bad luck behind. Shortly after his new car had burst into flames in his driveway, his house had also caught on fire in a separate incident, caused by a renegade spark from a dryer landing on a pile of clothes that had been used to soak up kerosene spill the day before. Unfortunately for the Karlsen family, the fire had started just outside the bathroom that Karl's wife Karl Karlsen was in. In an amazing streak of bad luck, the bathroom's window had also been boarded up, leaving the young woman stuck between an unbreakable board and an impassable firewall. So while Karl was able to usher he and his son Levi and their two daughters to safety, Christina unfortunately perished in the tragic accident. As Karl settled into his Varick, New York home with his new wife Cindy, he made sure to show her the news articles that he had saved from his tragic past, which hailed him as a hero. After all, he had saved 3 children from a roaring house fire. Cindy helped Karl find normalcy again, having another son with him named Alex. But around this time, Karl and Levi seemed to be growing distant. Despite having once saved his son's life, Levi seemed to be entering those typical teenage years where kids often search for independence via separation with their parents. So was that all that was going on here? Not quite. While there was an undertone of a search for acceptance from his father that belied all their arguing and fighting, a mother of Levi's friend, Cindy Meckley, called Levi a tortured young man. Having spent many nights at her house, Meckley said Levi would often wake up in the middle of the night crying and in cold sweats, having dreamt about his mother's death. You see, something had been eating away at Levi. He had heard his mother screaming for help that night, and couldn't figure out why his father was able to save him and his sisters but not his mother. By 2008, Levi had grown to become a divorced young dad of his own with 2 daughters. Still seeking his father's approval, he would often do odd jobs around his dad's house for cash. It was around this time, however, that Karl Karlsen's bad luck seemed to be returning. One night he woke Cindy up in a panic because his barn was on fire. Frantic, he ran to it and tried to open the large barn doors to save his 3 prized Belgian horses. But as the doors were made of metal, he was unable to touch them without being burned. In the barn and everything within it, including the horses, burned to the ground. Despite yet another tragedy, the family soldiered on. Karl continued to pay his eldest son for work around the house. One day, Levi was working on his father's truck as Karl, Cindy, and the kids were preparing to leave. And as they did, Karl went to the garage and talked to Levi for a few minutes while he was under the truck, and then rejoined his family in the car. 4 hours later, the family returned, and Karl made his way back over to the garage to see what progress Levi had made on the vehicle, when suddenly he came back running and banging on the home in its windows, screaming for Cindy to call the police. Levi was dead, the truck falling and having crushed him. Cindy called police, reporting her stepson's accident. Karl can be heard on the tape screaming in the background, "His chest is crushed." By the time law enforcement arrived, Karl was distraught, throwing himself against the garage walls and screaming at the thought of having lost his oldest son. But as law enforcement comforted the bereaved father and learned about his history of bad luck, something seemed amiss. So as police looked into the 2008 death of Levi Karlsen, they also pulled up the fire report that had resulted in Karl Karlsen's 1991 death, and noticed that the story of kerosene-soaked clothes Karlsen had told Cindy was one of only 3 different explanations he had provided to investigators years earlier. And law enforcement wasn't the only party beginning to question the truth behind Karl Karlsen's stories, as Levi's death had served as the straw that broke the camel's back for Cindy, who wondered how on earth one man could have so much horrible luck follow him around wherever he went. She tried to convince herself she must be going crazy. After all, she hadn't married and had a baby with a man who would kill his own wife and child, right? How could she make such an error in judgment? She carried it around, wondering, but hoping there was another explanation. She became so stressed over it she began having panic attacks, as she wondered about the safety of herself and the children. Her concerns furthered when she asked Karl how he had noticed the barn fire, since the barn wasn't really visible from their bedroom. He told her he heard the crackling of the fire, but Cindy recalled hearing no crackling from their bedroom. Finally, one day Cindy received a call from law enforcement that justified her fears. Another relative of Karlsen had called in with suspicions he was behind these incidents, and they wanted to speak to Cindy about it. After speaking with law enforcement, she became convinced her husband was guilty, and she returned home, taking young Alex and leaving the home she shared with Karl in hiding. But Karl didn't want to let her go, and when he called her for reconciliation, she devised a plan to get him to confess. Telling her husband she would only take him back if he was 100% honest about what had happened to Levi, she put together a homemade wire into a tape recorder and stuck it into her bra, meeting Karl at Angelina's restaurant to attempt to coax a confession from him. Amazingly, the plan worked. Karl confessed at dinner that he had pushed the car onto Levi intentionally in order to collect his life insurance money. Cindy excitedly ran to police with the recording, only to discover her homemade device had recorded nothing but unintelligible noise. And despite the risk of a repeated attempt alerting the elder Karlsen's suspicions, both law enforcement and Cindy knew they had to redo the operation to get Karl on tape admitting to the murder of his son. After equipping her with a new police-issued device, Cindy again met Karl at Angelina's restaurant, asking him to further explain himself. But this time, things didn't go so smoothly. Instantly, Karl told Cindy that he suspected she was recording him to set him up. Nervous and thinking on her feet, she offered up her purse for him to search. The bluff worked, and Karl again began speaking. But this time, however, his story had changed. Karl claimed not to have pushed the car on his son, but that he had found him crushed under the car before the family had left for the day, gotten nervous, and ran away, and decided to use his son's death as an opportunity. Though not outright confessing to murder, his lack of empathy and admission that he had found his son dead and then calmly pretended nothing was wrong for the next 4 hours, then pretending to find him afterwards, was enough to open a full investigation on his background. They discovered that Levi had taken out a life insurance policy on himself through work, and due to not trusting his ex-wife to handle the money for his daughters, he named his father as the beneficiary. In fact, in all 4 of Karlsen's bad luck incidents, he had profited financially through insurance. $707,210 for his son's death, $200,000 for his wife's death, $115,000 from the barn fire, and $10,000 from his new car exploding in flames, totaling over $1 million between the 4 incidents. Further investigation into his wife's death shows Karlsen's claims of having boarded up the bathroom window months before the fire were disputed by witnesses, who claimed he had actually put the board up either the morning of or day before the fire. Karl was brought in for an hours-long grind of an interview, where his story began to change once again. First claiming he had found the truck on his son, but later saying he had accidentally tipped the truck off the jack when he opened the door to get something inside the vehicle. But unconvinced that an unguilty man could let his son sit crushed under a truck for 4 hours while he calmly went on a trip with his family instead of getting him help, they pressed on and caused Karl to confess that he had, in fact, intentionally caused the truck to fall on his son. Karl was sentenced for Levi's 2008 death on December 16, 2013. Incredibly, he was only convicted to 15 years in prison. But luckily, California had also pressed charges, and Karlsen was eventually given a life sentence for the death of Christina Karlsen. His life sentence was to be served once his 15-year sentence in New York was finished. Cindy's vigilance may also have saved more lives than her own, as it was later found that Karl Karlsen had taken out two more $350,000 life insurance policies on Levi's daughters. Karl Karlsen is currently serving his life sentence, luckily never walking the streets to claim a victim ever again. I'm Jason Hebert, and thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.
Okay.